I remember reading a story about a man who had visited a school for the blind one day, and after being there for a while, he remarked that it must be terrible to go through life without your eyes. One of the students quickly responded, "It's not half so bad as having two good eyes, but still not being able to see." The point was well made. There is more than one kind of blindness, and perhaps none is more tragic than that which affects the eyes of our hearts. This morning's lesson identifies several forms of blindness, only one of which is physical. And that one, of course, was the problem affecting the beggar who was brought to the temple. Now, the writer of John in verse 1 says he was a man blind from birth. And as a person being blind from birth, he had never seen the faces of his friends. He had never seen the beautiful flowers that grew. He had never seen the smiles on people's faces. I recall once when I was in high school, we had a professor that was trying to teach us a particular lesson. And he asked two students to stand up, and he told one of them to pretend like he had been blind from birth. And, obviously that's a hard thing to do. But the other student was supposed to describe to him, if I remember right, it was the color green. Now, if you had never seen, that's basically an impossible task. And the professor was trying to get us to understand other people's positions and points of view. If we're not, grown up with something or fully aware of something, it's very difficult to understand. And think to yourself, try to describe the color green to somebody who, say, from another planet came and landed. How would you describe the color green? You always have to describe things based on previous experience, trying to find common denominators. Not an easy thing to do. If you're born blind, your whole understanding, your whole concept of the world around you is fashioned from your other four senses: smell, sound, taste, and touch. So anything that has to do with color is a meaningless concept. So that was the physical type of blindness that was described in the story, being without sight, physical sight. Another type of blindness that I've discovered in this story is theological blindness. The popular understanding in Jesus' day decreed that that type of suffering was the result of sin. Either it was the person themselves who had sinned, or it was their parents. And that's why the disciples asked Jesus, who was it that sinned? Was it this man, or was it his parents? Do you remember the story in Job? Job's associates, when they were coming to visit with him, they accused him of being a sinner. Otherwise, he wouldn't be going through so much unspeakable pain. Because their God was a God of judgment, not a God of mercy. In fact, in Exodus, it says that God remembers the iniquity of the parents to the third and fourth generation of their children. Now, that could be why genealogy is so popular. Everyone wants to know what it was that their great-great-grandparents did to cause them to suffer so much. In some ways, that point of view still has some credibility in today's world. Babies are born with some affliction or without certain limbs, perhaps. And some examples, really, are babies that are born afflicted with addictions that their parents had, whether it's some type of drug or AIDS because of a transfusion or something of that nature. So sometimes what our parents did or didn't do does affect how we are when we're born. The disciples certainly believed that children could inherit sin and guilt from their parents because they were confronted with the beggar at the temple. And they wanted to know who sinned, his parents or him. What they had missed was the compassionate nature of God. Jesus had been trying very hard through his repeated references to God as Father to get them to understand that God loved them. God does have a compassionate side. Jesus had labored very hard to teach them about mercy and about grace and how God wanted only good things for his children, whether they deserved it or not. So the disciples, at least at this point, were somewhat theologically blind. Another type of blindness revealed in the story is the blindness I would call prejudicial type blindness. Now I know I'm not the only one who has looked at some foods that perhaps were from a different culture or just some recipe. When we read the ingredients, we immediately form an opinion in our head that I'm not going to try that. I remember as a kid, Mom would serve something and it looked funny. It just, that's the only expression kids say, it looks funny. I had a prejudice already without ever having tasted it. As I matured in life and I learned to taste some of these funny looking dishes, I realized what I'd been missing because some of them were outstanding. In this story, there is a prejudicial blindness. It's found in the neighbors and the worshipers who had seen the beggar at the temple every day for many, many years. They were unwilling to concede that he could be healed of his blindness, that he could ever change. Even after Christ touched him, his eyes were open. They said, no, it is not him, but someone like him. They had already formed their opinion, so they were blind to the reality. And they were unwilling to alter their opinion once it had been formed. Now I promise we have all met, and perhaps have at times ourselves been, someone who, once we formed an opinion about something, no amount of facts in the world will change it, because that's the way we want it. Another type of blindness in the story is what I would call emotional blindness. It reflects the attitude of the parents. Remember in the story how the parents reacted to his being healed? Now the man himself gave credit where credit is due. Jesus had opened his eyes and he proclaimed to all who would listen, he is a prophet. But the Pharisees were standing by and they wanted to discredit Jesus. And they challenged the man's parents to give an explanation for what had happened. Now picture yourself, your child just been healed. Not even a child, grown man, but you're still your child. Has been healed of some malady. You're going to be overjoyed, I would suspect. You're going to be happy. You're going to be praising God, praising somebody, thanking the doctors or whoever, whatever happened. Well, these parents didn't exactly jump up and down and shout for joy. Why? Because the Pharisees were challenging them, and they were afraid of a couple of things. Number one, they didn't want to be ostracized. They were fearful of being kicked out of the synagogue. And if you were kicked out, you were basically an outcast in the community. So they weren't jumping up and down for joy, shedding tears of happiness. Instead, they were nervously counting the cost of discipleship. How much did they stand to lose by standing up and being honest? They knew the Sabbath laws, and they knew Jesus had broken the Sabbath laws. They knew their son's standing in the religious community was in jeopardy because he actually praised Jesus, called him a prophet. They also knew that they would be cut off from their friends if they got booted out of the synagogue. So what did they do? Well, there was only one out for someone who was looking to walk that fine line. They answered, "We do not know how it is that now he sees, nor do we know who opened his eyes." Then they lay it all back on him. Ask him. He is of age. Even in our own societies, up to a certain point, certain age, parents are responsible for their children. Sometimes even after a certain age. But they didn't want to stand up to him. They said, ask him. He's old enough. So they had to ask him. They were short-sighted in their self-centeredness. They could only see as far as their own interests and their own security. And it's tragic, just as that person at the blind school said, having two good eyes, but still being unable to see. The last blindness I want to talk about is spiritual blindness. This is evident in the Pharisees. Jesus had become a threat to them, and he was saying things that they had not said. He was doing things that they were unable to do. And many people were actually listening to this man, Jesus. Jesus even caused problems among the Pharisees. Verse 16 says, and they were divided. Remember, one person said he's not of God because he is doing work on the Sabbath. He broke the Sabbath law, so he couldn't be of God. Another one said, yeah, but if he's not of God, he couldn't be healing people. So he has to be of God. So they were divided. The Pharisees were convinced that Jesus had to be silenced. It was the Sabbath when Jesus healed the blind man, and that was the ammunition that the Pharisees needed to accuse him. The legalists, the Pharisees, were more concerned with religious rules and rituals and regulations than they were with love. They were looking for a public stone to throw at the rabbi from Nazareth, and they found it. The Pharisees were so bound by their adherence to the law that the pain and disability of a blind beggar at the temple door was ignored. Ritual took precedent over compassion. They were spiritually blind. How easy it is for us to look at other persons and not see them in their true light. How easy it is for us to misjudge others because of external issues like age or race or gender, political affiliation, something as superficial as the kind of clothes people wear, or whether they have tattoos or ornaments in their eyebrow or lip. We immediately form judgments and feel good about ourselves. The Pharisees looked at the Messiah and saw him as a threat instead of a blessing. You would think they would want to join up with this guy who can heal people. The neighbors at the temple looked at the man who had been healed and said, it is not him, it is someone like him. Having eyes they did not see. You know, I think it's easy for each of us to become blind to the truth, especially about ourselves, unless we allow Christ to open the eyes of our hearts. Only then can true transformation take place. And Jesus does that for us, even as he did it for the blind beggar. He opens our eyes that we may see others as children of God, and that we may see ourselves not only as we are, but as we may yet become in Christ. What Jesus did for the beggar, he can do for us. He can open the eyes of our hearts that we no longer stumble in the darkness of this world, but at last may truly come to realize and have a better understanding of why we're here.